People think the perfect revenge is watching your enemy burn. They are wrong. The sweetest revenge is being the only person holding a fire extinguisher and deciding to buy their burning empire for pennies on the dollar. When an arrogant kid tried to erase my 12 years of hard work because his fancy degree cost more, he thought I would beg. He had no idea the countdown to his absolute destruction had just begun. Hello to all the amazing listeners of Boss Revenge Stories, and thank you so much for your continuous support. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us entirely without the operating budget required to keep the lights on, which means we are forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future, and will be shifting our operations entirely over to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please help us keep this project alive by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel, where you can listen to even more incredible, exclusive true stories that are longer, feature much more detailed situations that we simply cannot make public on YouTube, and are brought to life by a full cast of emotional voice actors. You can easily join by scanning the QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link found in the description and the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's tale of corporate karma, told through the eyes of our protagonist, Scarlett Grant. I sat perfectly still in the sterile, glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of Aegis Core Medical Logistics. The Chicago skyline loomed gray and unforgiving behind the man sitting across from me, the biting winter wind silently battering the reinforced glass. That man was Julian Vance, the newly appointed Vice President of Strategy and, entirely by bloodline, the son of our brand-new Chief Executive Officer. The air in the room felt artificially cold, heavy with the suffocating scent of expensive cologne and unearned corporate arrogance. Julian did not even bother to look me in the eye as he slid a thick, freshly printed contract across the polished mahogany table. Keeping his gaze firmly fixed on his sleek tablet, he casually announced that my salary and annual bonuses were being slashed by 40%. According to his flawless corporate jargon, this was a necessary capital restructuring to free up funds for his visionary new artificial intelligence strategy. I looked down at the insulting numbers on the paper, then back up at his perfectly styled hair and custom-tailored suit, keeping my voice dangerously level. I asked him how severing the pay of the very person keeping his logistics grid from collapsing could possibly be justified as fair. Julian finally looked up, leaning back in his imported leather chair with a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. My MBA is worth more than your 12 years of field experience, Scarlett, he stated, his voice dripping with absolute certainty. You just do maintenance work. It is not leadership thinking. I tightened my grip beneath the table, suppressing the violent storm brewing in my chest. I calmly reminded him that the complex cold supply chain routing system, the exact architecture I had coded by hand from the ground up, was currently keeping billions of dollars worth of highly sensitive medical supplies safe across the entire United States every single day, I explained, speaking slowly as if addressing a stubborn child. That those critical therapeutics survived solely because my system intimately understood the volatile variables of real-world transit. Julian actually laughed. It was a short, breathy scoff that echoed loudly in the quiet room. He waved his hand dismissively, declaring that my legacy system was an outdated dinosaur. He boasted that the shiny, off-the-shelf automated software he had just purchased for millions of dollars was more than capable of replacing my manual labor. In his narrow mind, I was just a glorified mechanic standing in the way of his brilliant modernization. He leaned forward, clearly expecting me to argue, to raise my voice, or to beg for my livelihood so he could fully exercise his new authority. Instead, I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a crisp, unmarked white envelope. I placed it gently on top of his insulting contract and slid both documents back across the glass table. It was my formal letter of resignation, effective immediately. Julian stared at the envelope. The smugness instantly evaporated from his face, rapidly replaced by an ugly, frantic flush of anger. He sputtered, accusing me of throwing a pathetic tantrum just because I could not adapt to modern business practices. I did not give him the satisfaction of a single spoken word. I unclipped my company identification badge, the one I had proudly worn for over a decade, and dropped it onto the table. It landed with a sharp, final clack. I stood up, smoothed the front of my blazer, and walked out of the boardroom, striding straight into the executive elevator without looking back a single time. That evening, the ambient lighting of a secluded downtown jazz lounge cast a warm, golden glow over my corner booth. The air was thick with the soothing, melancholy melody of a slow saxophone and the rich, earthy aroma of aged oak. I sat back against the plush leather cushion, slowly swirling a glass of neat, top-shelf bourbon, taking a long, deliberate sip. I let the sharp warmth slide down my throat, washing away the lingering sterile chill of the corporate world. Lying face up on the mahogany table in front of me was my personal smartphone. With 3 simple taps, I had severed my digital leash. I wiped the corporate server profile, uninstalled the encrypted logistics dashboard, and completely disabled all notifications from anyone outside my immediate circle. For the first time in over a decade, the evening belonged entirely to me. I took another sip, sinking into the profound, absolute quiet of a mind unburdened by corporate emergencies. Miles away, high up in the illuminated glass fortress of the logistics headquarters, the atmosphere was drastically different. The operations center buzzed with a tense, artificial energy. Standing at the helm of the Central Command console was Julian, flanked by a few nervous middle managers eager to witness the dawn of his automated era. With a theatrical flourish and a smug grin of unearned victory, he pressed the large execution command on the master touchscreen. The monitors flickered, shifting from my meticulously hand-coded interface to a sleek, minimalist dashboard powered by his newly acquired artificial intelligence. The transition was seamless on the surface. Julian crossed his arms, basking in the cold glow of the screens, fully convinced that his expensive academic theories had just rendered human intuition obsolete. But reality does not operate on theoretical models, and nature certainly does not respect academic degrees. At exactly 11 o'clock at night, a brutal, unseasonal blizzard violently slammed into the American Midwest. It was a massive weather front, bringing blinding whiteout conditions, plummeting temperatures, and sheets of solid black ice that rapidly transformed major arterial highways into impassable death traps. State troopers immediately began shutting down interstate routes, forcing human drivers to seek shelter. However, the shiny new automated software lacked the nuanced, real-time meteorological integration that my legacy system possessed. The algorithm was completely blind to the extreme weather variables, operating strictly on the logic of the shortest geographical distance. The software began ruthlessly redirecting dozens of 18-wheeler trucks, heavily loaded with temperature-controlled pharmaceuticals, straight into the chaotic heart of the blizzard. Disaster struck with terrifying speed, without the dynamic routing protocols to guide them to safe harbor facilities. The transport fleets became stranded on blocked, freezing country roads. The extreme external temperatures began rapidly draining the auxiliary power units of the refrigerated trailers. Inside the operations center, the sleek new monitors suddenly transformed into a chaotic sea of flashing crimson warnings. Critical temperature alerts shrieked across the command floor, one after another. The automated system was throwing fatal errors, completely unable to compute the physical roadblock variables. Millions of dollars worth of highly volatile organic compounds were now sitting in the freezing dark, facing total spoilage in less than 6 hours. The night shift engineering team descended into sheer panic. Keyboards clattered frantically as they tried to manually override the locked algorithmic pathways. But the new software had rigidly restricted their administrative access. Desperate, the lead engineer bypassed the chain of command and dialed Julian directly. When the vice president finally answered, roused from his sleep, the reality of the collapsing grid hit him like a physical blow. The confident strategist from the afternoon was gone, replaced by a terrified novice staring down the barrel of a catastrophic failure. The engineers begged him for the administrative override codes or a structural solution to bypass the gridlock. Julian had absolutely no idea how the underlying architecture functioned or how to intervene, he stammered, his voice cracking with rising hysteria as the financial damage counter on the main screen climbed higher by the second. Stripped of his corporate shield and faced with a genuine crisis, he could only issue one frantic, desperate command. "Call Scarlett immediately!" he screamed into the receiver, his voice echoing through the chaotic operations floor. "I do not care what time it is. Just get her on the phone right now." Back in the dim warmth of the jazz lounge, the saxophone reached a smooth, mournful crescendo. On the table, my phone lit up, then it vibrated, then it lit up again. Over the next hour, a torrential flood of incoming communications battered the device. Dozens of frantic phone calls from the operations center, unread text messages begging for a callback, and high-priority emails from the Human Resources Department poured in. The device danced silently against the wood. I did not touch it. I simply watched the screen illuminate the dark table, a silent strobe light of corporate panic. Let the screens flash red. I thought to myself, let the academic theories freeze on the snowy highways. I finished the last drop of my bourbon, signaled the bartender for the check, and left the chaos to drown in the silent void of my ignored calls. By the time the bleak, unforgiving winter sun finally dragged itself above the frozen Chicago skyline, the following morning, the financial bleeding at the logistics firm had escalated into a catastrophic hemorrhage. The damage counter displayed on the massive digital screens of the main operations floor had permanently frozen at a staggering $15 million in completely ruined, highly temperature-sensitive medical cargo. Yet, the monumental monetary loss was merely the superficial layer of this corporate nightmare. The catastrophic failure to maintain the mandatory cold chain protocols had inevitably triggered automatic federal compliance alarms. The Food and Drug Administration was now officially involved. They had launched an aggressive, rapidly escalating preliminary inquiry into severe transport safety violations, turning a disastrous internal operational failure into a terrifying federal incident. For the newly minted Vice President of Strategy, the stark reality of the situation meant total, reversible annihilation. If the corporate board of directors discovered that his heavily championed, astronomically expensive automated software was the sole and direct cause of a massive federal investigation, he would not just be summarily terminated, he would be facing intense federal prosecution for gross corporate negligence, effectively erasing his carefully curated executive career before it even truly began. The sleek, transparent walls of his corner office must have felt like a tightening vice, slowly crushing the breath out of his lungs. Driven by the primal, suffocating terror of a cornered animal, he decided to cross the fatal, invisible boundary line, separating mere managerial incompetence from outright, premeditated criminality. In a state of pure, sweat-drenched panic, he immediately summoned the lead internal security technicians, heavily locking the thick acoustic doors of the executive suite behind them. Pacing the expensive carpet with manic, erratic energy, he issued a highly illegal directive that turned the atmosphere in the room ice cold. He ordered his technical team to deeply comb through the central server architecture and meticulously fabricate entirely new system log files. The objective was dark, precise, and entirely malicious. He demanded that they plant fraudulent lines of rogue code deep within the system transition sequence to make it look exactly as if a hostile actor had intentionally corrupted the primary routing algorithms. He wanted to frame my abrupt departure not as a voluntary resignation, but as a deliberate, vindictive act of corporate sabotage. Simultaneously, he began drafting a massive, carefully worded internal memorandum, intentionally seeding toxic rumors throughout the secure corporate network. He painted a highly distorted picture of me as a disgruntled, technologically obsolete worker who simply snapped under pressure and tried to burn the entire company down on my way out the door. He was meticulously building a fabricated criminal profile, frantically gathering forged digital evidence to serve me up as the perfect, defenseless scapegoat to the approaching federal regulators. He was actively preparing to send me to a federal penitentiary for decades, solely to save his own skin. However, corporate walls are notoriously thin, and digital footprints are incredibly difficult to mask from those who know exactly where and how to look. Elena, a diligent mid-level data compliance manager, was running standard diagnostic recovery checks on the secondary servers when she stumbled upon a highly restricted, heavily encrypted folder buried deep within the administrative drive. Years ago, when Elena was just a terrified junior analyst facing wrongful termination over a massive billing error, she absolutely did not commit. I had personally spent 3 grueling days dissecting the central database to completely clear her name and save her livelihood. She had never forgotten that monumental debt. When she quietly bypassed the basic security protocols of that restricted folder and saw the crude, frantic attempts to digitally forge my unique administrative signature onto malicious command scripts, the blood completely drained from her face. Her hands began to shake violently over her keyboard as she realized instantly what she was looking at. They were actively manufacturing a federal crime from scratch, and they were firmly stamping my name directly onto the murder weapon, risking her entire career and potentially her own freedom. Elena immediately sneaked down to the chaotic, heavily shadowed basement levels of the building. She securely locked herself inside an empty soundproof utility closet, sliding to the floor in the dark, taking shallow breaths. She dialed my encrypted secondary number using an unregistered, untraceable burner phone. When I calmly answered the call, her voice was a rapid, terrified whisper echoing through the receiver. She desperately laid out the entire sinister plot in agonizing detail, explaining exactly how the vice president was desperately trying to rewrite digital history to pin the $15 million disaster squarely on my shoulders. She frantically warned me that stern federal investigators were already demanding the immediate surrender of the primary server logs, and the forged documents were scheduled to be handed over by exactly 12 o'clock in the afternoon. She begged me to hire a criminal defense attorney immediately. I stood silently by the large bay window of my quiet apartment, peacefully watching the relentless, beautiful snow continue to bury the busy city streets far below. A cold, deeply predatory smile slowly stretched across my face as I listened to her panicked, breathless warnings. I told Elena to take a deep, slow breath and calm down. I sincerely thanked her for her incredible loyalty and bravery, but I firmly assured her that she did not need to spend a single second worrying about my freedom. I gently explained to her through the phone that you do not spend 12 long years building an impenetrable digital fortress without knowing exactly how to securely lock every single door behind you. I revealed to her that on the late evening, right before I handed over that white resignation envelope, I had taken a comprehensive, deeply encrypted snapshot of the entire uncorrupted source code. I had then permanently sealed that pristine, flawless data block with a decentralized, third-party cryptographic timestamp, legally and undeniably validating the exact perfect condition of the system. The very millisecond I relinquished my administrative access, any alterations, forgeries, or malicious code injected after that specific moment in time would automatically trigger an irrefutable forensic discrepancy report that any federal investigator would spot instantly. Howe was not cleverly framing me. He was simply wrapping his own neck in a meticulously crafted, totally inescapable legal noose, and I was going to comfortably sit back and watch him pull it tight. I did not reach for my phone to retain a high-priced defense attorney. I did not draft a frantic, defensive email to the board of directors pleading my innocence, nor did I waste a single breath worrying about a fabricated criminal profile. When you are standing in the path of a desperate, flailing enemy, playing defense is a fool's errand. Instead, I carefully put on a sharp, charcoal gray tailored suit, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight into the heart of enemy territory. My destination was not a courthouse or a police station. It was the towering, obsidian glass monolith of Vanguard Omnicorp, the largest, most aggressive competitor in our sector and the sworn blood enemy of my former employers. For over a decade, Vanguard had tried relentlessly to crush us, only to be constantly outmaneuvered by the unbreakable efficiency of the routing architecture I had personally built. I walked through their cavernous, marble-lined lobby with the confident, unhurried stride of an apex predator returning to the hunting grounds. Because of my extensive tenure and the legendary reputation of my logistical frameworks across the industry, getting past the executive security desk was surprisingly effortless. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting in a hyper-modern, soundproof boardroom, looking directly across a massive slate table at the chief executive officer of Vanguard Omnicorp. I was an older, ruthlessly pragmatic man who had spent the last 10 years trying to figure out how to break my systems. He stared at me with a mixture of intense suspicion and profound curiosity. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries or meaningless corporate small talk. I simply reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out a small, matte black secure flash drive, and placed it precisely in the center of the table. Inside that drive, I began, keeping my voice dangerously calm and perfectly measured, is the absolute, unfiltered truth about the catastrophic failure currently unfolding across the Midwestern supply grid. You are already aware that they are bleeding capital on ruined cargo. But what you do not know, and what their own leadership is desperately trying to conceal, is the underlying structural decay. They are standing directly on top of a digital landmine, and the fuse is burning faster than they can possibly comprehend. The chief executive officer leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he instructed his chief technology officer to plug the drive into an isolated terminal. I stood up and walked over to the presentation screen, projecting a sharply detailed, uncompromising analytical breakdown of the unfolding disaster. They are currently entering the most vulnerable 48 hours in their entire corporate history, I explained, pointing to the cascading failure charts that were now illuminating the dark room. Their new automated algorithm has completely overridden all manual safety protocols, locking their own engineers out of the grid. As we speak, federal investigators are demanding unredacted access to their server architecture because of the blatant regulatory violations regarding the temperature-controlled transit of highly sensitive biological compounds. The probability of a federal mandate freezing their operational assets is exactly 100%. By tomorrow morning, their stock valuation will not just dip, it will enter a catastrophic, irreversible freefall. I paused, letting the immense gravity of the situation fully settle over the Vanguard executive team. I could see the initial shock on their faces rapidly morphing into cold, calculated predatory interest. I laid out a map of their leveraged debt, pointing out exactly which institutional lenders would panic first once the federal subpoenas became public knowledge. I am not here to sell you a software patch or a temporary solution, I continued, locking eyes with the chief executive officer. I am here to hand you the keys to their entire kingdom. I have drafted a comprehensive, highly aggressive blueprint for a hostile takeover. If we execute this precise sequence of financial maneuvers, while they are completely paralyzed by the federal inquiry and their own internal technological blindness, you can aggressively acquire their leveraged debt, swallow their entire market share, and seize their physical assets for exactly 1/10 of their actual market valuation. You will buy an empire for the price of scrap metal. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The Vanguard leadership team exchanged stunned, deeply respectful glances. They were looking at a masterclass in corporate warfare, completely stripped of emotion and executed with surgical precision. The chief executive officer slowly leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He turned to his head of human resources, who was sitting completely speechless at the end of the table. "Draft the onboarding paperwork immediately," he ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. He turned his sharp gaze back to me, nodding in profound approval. "Effective right this very minute. You are officially the head of mergers and acquisitions audit for Vanguard Omnicorp. You have complete, unrestricted authority over this entire transaction. Whatever resources, capital, or legal leverage you require, you have it." While a terrified, arrogant child was crawling through the mud of his own incompetence miles away, frantically trying to forge documents and plant dirty rumors to save his fragile ego, I had just armed his greatest rival with the most destructive financial weapons ever conceived. I had quietly loaded the gun, handed it to the executioner, and secured my seat in the front row. The board was irrevocably set. The trap was perfectly laid. All I had to do now was wait patiently for the absolute, inevitable collapse of his miserable illusion. By the dawn of day 3 since I walked out of that glass boardroom, the fragile illusion of control at my former company had completely shattered. The federal agents from the Food and Drug Administration did not send another polite email requesting a meeting. They arrived unannounced, marching straight through the grand revolving glass doors of the main lobby in Chicago, armed with heavy briefcases and immediate, sweeping subpoenas. The reaction of the financial markets was swift and utterly brutal. The exact second the news of the federal raid leaked to the aggressive financial media networks, the corporate stock price began a catastrophic, vertical freefall. Anchorwomen on live television were gleefully dissecting the massive logistics failure, reporting that the company had lost hundreds of millions of dollars in market capitalization in just the first 2 hours of morning trading. Halfway across the world, Marcus Vance, the seasoned chief executive officer and the father of the architect of this entire disaster, was forced to abruptly abandon a highly publicized European expansion tour. He boarded a private jet in Geneva and raced back to the freezing winds of the Midwest. When Marcus finally stormed into the executive suite on the 40th floor, the air was thick with the suffocating scent of impending doom and panicked sweat. The senior compliance attorneys had already intercepted the deeply flawed, fabricated server logs. They grimly presented Marcus with the irrefutable forensic discrepancy report, the undeniable proof triggered by the immutable cryptographic timestamp I had left behind. The terrible truth hit the older executive like a physical blow to the chest. His son had not just accidentally paralyzed the entire medical grid with a foolish, untested technological purchase. His son had actively attempted to commit federal perjury and systematic data forgery, a severe felony that would undoubtedly drag the entire executive board and the family name straight into a federal penitentiary. Standing in the center of that glass-walled office, surrounded by horrified legal counsel and trembling vice presidents, Marcus Vance raised his hand and delivered a violently sharp, echoing slap directly across Julian's pale face. The sound cracked like a whip through the silent room. The arrogant boy who had boldly sneered at my 12 years of hands-on experience just 72 hours earlier instantly collapsed into a miserable, sobbing heap on the expensive imported carpet, completely stripped of his false bravado. Marcus knew the unforgiving, cutthroat realities of the logistics industry better than anyone else in that building. He understood instantly that no team of expensive corporate lawyers could magically fix a broken algorithmic routing system, and no shiny automated software could charm furious federal regulators. There was exactly one human being on the face of the earth who possessed the intricate architectural knowledge required to manually untangle the frozen supply lines, bypass the locked artificial intelligence, and pacify the angry government agents. Just 4 hours later, a heavy, desperate knock echoed through my quiet apartment. I slowly opened the door to find Marcus Vance standing alone in my hallway. The proud, towering corporate titan looked utterly hollowed out. His expensive bespoke suit was deeply wrinkled. His face was pale and drawn, and his shoulders sagged heavily under the crushing weight of total ruin. He stepped inside and practically begged, stripping away all of his usual executive pride. He offered me the absolute top title of Executive Vice President right there on the spot. He desperately promised a base salary exactly 5 times larger than my previous compensation package, swearing to have the massive figure completely guaranteed in writing by the end of the day. He even looked me dead in the eye and swore to personally terminate his own son's employment, promising to banish Julian from the corporate industry forever if I would just come back and fix the frozen grid. I listened quietly to his frantic pleading, offering him a polite, entirely sympathetic smile that intentionally did not reach my eyes. I gently shook my head, keeping my voice incredibly soft but completely immovable. "I sincerely thank you for the generous offer, Marcus," I said smoothly. "However, I must firmly decline. I have already accepted a highly fulfilling new position elsewhere, and my schedule is completely booked." I paused, letting the finality of my words hang in the air. I strongly suggest that instead of wasting your rapidly diminishing capital on empty promises, you should immediately contact your legal team and begin preparing the official corporate bankruptcy filings. I watched the final, desperate shred of hope drain completely from his exhausted eyes. As he stumbled backward out of my doorway, the crushing, inescapable reality finally washed over him. He realized in that agonizing, silent moment that his once mighty empire had absolutely no leverage left. The only surviving option to avoid total federal liquidation and save his employees from immediate termination was to desperately surrender his dying company to his worst enemy, Vanguard Omnicorp, before his remaining assets evaporated completely into thin air. The heavy oak doors of the primary executive negotiation suite at Vanguard Omnicorp swung open, revealing a breathtaking view of the frozen Chicago skyline. The room was a monument to absolute financial dominance, lined with dark mahogany and polished obsidian. Walking into this imposing space were Marcus Vance and his son, Julian. Marcus moved with the slow, defeated shuffle of a man walking to his own execution, desperately hoping to salvage some tiny fraction of his family legacy and protect his thousands of employees from immediate mass layoffs. Right behind him was Julian, his face completely drained of color, his expensive custom suit hanging off his shoulders as if he had aged 20 years in a single weekend. His hands shook visibly at his sides. The arrogance that had defined him just days prior was entirely gone, replaced by the primal terror of a cornered animal facing the slaughterhouse. They took their seats on the far side of the massive, custom-built slate table, facing a row of high-backed leather chairs that were currently turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Vanguard Corporate Council sat silently to the side, their faces completely unreadable. Marcus cleared his throat, attempting to summon whatever tiny shred of executive authority he still possessed, and announced that the leadership of Aegis Corps was ready to begin the surrender proceedings. The central high-backed chair slowly swiveled around. Marcus physically recoiled, his breath catching sharply in his throat. Julian let out a choked, pathetic gasp, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror. Sitting at the absolute head of the table, representing the Vanguard acquisition team with total, unrestricted authority, was me. I was wearing a sharp-tailored navy suit, my hands resting calmly on top of a thick red leather binder. I looked directly into Julian's terrified eyes and offered a slow, chillingly polite smile that contained absolutely no warmth. "Good morning, gentlemen," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the cavernous boardroom. "I am Scarlett Grant, the newly appointed head of Mergers and Acquisitions Audit for Vanguard Omnicorp. I will be handling the precise valuation and subsequent liquidation of your rapidly disintegrating assets today." For a long, agonizing moment, neither Marcus nor Julian could speak. The absolute shock of the power reversal had completely paralyzed them. Marcus finally found his voice, sputtering in confusion, asking how this was even remotely possible. I did not give him the courtesy of an explanation. I simply opened the red binder, the sound of the crisp paper flipping over echoing like a gunshot. "Let us discuss the strategic value of your enterprise," I began, intentionally wielding the exact, soulless corporate jargon Julian had used to insult me at our last meeting. "Upon reviewing your current operational structure, I have noticed a severe lack of leadership thinking. Your recent capital restructuring initiatives, specifically your visionary artificial intelligence strategy, have fundamentally destroyed your core logistical capabilities." I stood up, slowly pacing the length of the table, my eyes locked on Julian. "You see, Julian, your automated software was an absolute marvel of theoretical efficiency. I am sure it looked fantastic on a spreadsheet in whatever Ivy League classroom you bought your degree from. But out here in the real world, a Master of Business Administration degree does not stop a Midwestern blizzard. A piece of paper does not keep biological compounds from freezing on a blocked highway. Your profound ignorance, masked by unearned authority, has brought a billion-dollar empire to its knees in less than 100 hours. I turned my attention to the Vanguard leadership team sitting beside me, and then back to the Vances. systematically dismantling Julian's entire professional existence in front of the most powerful executives in the city. I exposed exactly how his sheer incompetence had triggered the federal raid, completely shattering the myth of his financial genius. I left absolutely nothing intact. I returned to my seat and slid a single, precisely printed document across the slate table. These are the final, non-negotiable terms of the hostile takeover, I announced. Vanguard Omnicorp will acquire the remaining physical assets and the leveraged debt of Aegis Corp for exactly 4 cents on the dollar. It is a pathetic valuation, but it is exactly what your broken infrastructure is worth today. Marcus looked down at the contract, his hands trembling. He opened his mouth to negotiate, to beg for a higher fraction, but I raised my hand to silence him immediately. There is one mandatory, uncompromising prerequisite before Vanguard signs this document and saves your innocent employees from losing their livelihoods, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Julian Vance is to be terminated for cause, effective at this exact second. Furthermore, as part of the acquisition compliance, Vanguard will officially surrender the completely unredacted server logs, including all verified proof of attempted digital forgery, directly to the federal investigators. Julian let out a loud, pathetic sob, violently shaking his head. He looked at his father, his eyes pleading for salvation. Handing over those specific logs meant an absolute, lifetime ban from the corporate sector and a guaranteed, lengthy federal prison sentence for data manipulation. It was the complete, undeniable death of his entire life. "You cannot do this to me," Julian stammered, tears streaming freely down his pale cheeks. "Dad, please, you cannot sign that. They will destroy me." Marcus looked at his weeping son, and then he looked at the contract. He knew exactly what was at stake. If he walked away, his entire company would be permanently liquidated by the government by tomorrow morning, and thousands of hardworking people would be utterly ruined. The old man closed his eyes, a tear escaping down his weathered face. With a trembling hand, Marcus Vance picked up the silver pen and signed his name on the dotted line, legally executing the professional and personal demise of his own son. The transaction was complete. The Vanguard attorneys immediately stepped forward to collect the documents. I stood up, calmly buttoning the front of my suit jacket. Julian, completely broken and shaking violently, looked up at me from his chair. His voice was a pathetic, ragged whisper. "Why?" he choked out, staring at me as if I were a monster. "Why did you have to back us into a corner like this? Why did you destroy everything?" I stopped, resting my hands on the slate table, and leaned in close so only he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. I smiled, looking directly into his terrified, broken eyes. "I did not back you into a corner," I said softly, every word perfectly measured. "I am simply optimizing the supply chain. Mr. Vice President, now, please leave my building." Thank you to every single one of you, amazing listeners, for joining us today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story of corporate justice satisfying, I have an important request. Because YouTube has demonetized our channel and stripped our operating budget, we will unfortunately not be able to upload any new videos here in the near future. We are transitioning our entire operation over to Patreon. Please help us keep this project alive by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to our very best, highly exclusive true stories that are far too intense and detailed to make public on YouTube. You can support us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link located in the video description and the pinned comment. Thank you for keeping the stories alive.